So first of all, I looked at whether a tile of 3 pips on a Lego would work. It was close to a 1-inch tile, but I found that it was a little small for me. So looking at a 3-inch or a 4-pip tile, it's a little bit larger than 1 inch, but I thought perhaps the larger size would be better for minis that might have larger bases, or if there was something that needed to be sort of put on the edge of a tile. So that was the next thing that I looked at was how big a regular tile would be. So I 3D printed a tile based on the measurements of the 4-pip tile, or 4-pip Lego, and found that it was about 32 millimeters. I made it a little smaller, 31 and a half, so that it would fit adjacent to each other without being too tight. I also made sure that it ends up the pip on the bottom of the tile matched the size that would fit between the gaps in a Lego. I could have put more pips on the bottom, but I found that 5 was about the right number to make the tile stable, but still fit onto the standard Lego pip base plate, and still leave a little bit of a gap. So it was time to look at molding. So I created molds using my favorite caulking silicone and acrylic paint, or red acrylic paint from the craft store, to create several molds that were based on the same tile block so that I could cast several at a time. I use a product for my casting called Ultimate Dry Stone. It's got a really good density and strength to it once it's cast, much better than plaster of Paris. So from the molds I have, I calculated about 100 grams of plaster to 36 grams of water for the first portion. I'll have to add some more plaster afterwards, but I wanted to get the mix right for the first blend. A little more water to plaster ratio makes it easier to blend for the first bit. So to the mixer for the blending, and then back to add the additional 36 grams of plaster to make up the mix to the right ratio for what I've found gives me the best kind of final product. Okay, now fill in the molds. I always make sure that as I'm filling the molds, I tap the bottom to try and settle out any bubbles. You want to fill these molds to be a little bit more than full, just so that you're sure that there's no missing parts to the top of the tile. Later on, you can come back and tidy up the overflow. You tap it a couple of times in order to make sure that it settles down. And then, of course, 5 minutes of waiting lets it cure a little or set a bit, and then you can skim the top, tidy up the overflow, the amount that you've filled more than the tile's top. This is also an opportunity, if you find any low ones, to kind of shift some of the plaster into it. I always give it a little bit of a tap to remove any tool markings from the top after it's been settled. We wait 3 minutes for it to start to settle up, and then we can start texturing the first level of texture, which is kind of the global texture. If you're doing rock, you create a little bit of roughness. If you're doing something like a wood, you'll see I come back and I use the classic bristle brush in order to create some striations and some lines in it that later will show the wood texture through. This is just one option. I start with the sponge. Sometimes I'll use the back side of the bristles in order to create a little deeper, and then you'll see also I come back later and can add it with the tin foil ball, or something that I've decided to do is I've actually made a small piece of plaster with the tin foil actually cast onto it. It ensures that the aluminum ball doesn't get pushed in and the texture break away from use. The plaster backs up the tin foil to give it a little more strength. It lets me push a little harder when I need to, and use the same piece over and over again, rather than having to redo a aluminum ball every time that I go to do some texturing. Now you'll want to wait a little bit before you try to demold. As you're demolding, you'll see that the tiles sometimes are not quite dry, and a couple of them can chip or break while you're removing them. But you know what? You move them aside. If they're not too bad, you can put them in, and little broken tiles just add character to the assembly later on. When you're using that tile, you can paint the edges and make it look like it's actually something that's happened on purpose. Or for that matter, if you really need the full tile, you can always glue back in that one piece that snapped off, and it just becomes a crack to create some character. Now by putting it in this jig, I can scratch in some straight lines for the wood tiles, giving me uniform planks that I find make the character a little bit more to my liking. I go back and add some deeper grooves in for the wood grains. Now I already have the scratched in wood grain for the fine lines, but it also lets me divide up the boards into some smaller sections. The nice thing about this is because it's hand done, no two tiles are exactly identical, and yet they still have the same kind of general shape, and the boards line up with each other while still giving that character that you look for in randomness of wood. I also use the tool to do some more cracks and different character into the actual stone tiles. At this point it ends up, it's sort of the artist's or whatever you're looking for in terms of the character that you like to see. This tool is a real great one. It's just a sharp point that I can work with and cut some grooves in. You can even come back with this stuff over the next about 24 hours and put in some more detail if you want to use a grinder tool or something that's more aggressive. Here I'm just carving in some flagstone appearance, sort of blocks of or loose stones. And then on this last tile I'm going to do an actual grid, like a tile system of 4x4 on this one tile. Later on, if it ended up you wanted to, you could do a checker pattern, you could do something a little bit more random, or for that matter it could be something that's colored to match a puzzle or a challenge that your players might come across. So you just tidy up the loose ends and let it set a little bit more. You can see some of the details here. It ends up that there's a better quality, so you can see those smaller tiles. You can see the flagstone character there. This one's the broken tile, so I just added a bit more cracking to it. And now the wood detail shows up really well on this, I find. I like to Mod Podge. Black Magic Craft has a really great mix where it's black paint and Mod Podge about 50-50. I like to coat my tiles, even though technically I could just use a black paint at this point. These things are pretty hard, they don't need any additional strength. But I find the sealer helps when I put it on. It gives me a better paint job afterwards. And I just coat all the edges. The bottom's not important, and I find it's sometimes better not to coat the bottom. That way the tiles sit on the grid better. If it's a little too tight, sometimes they're harder to push in. I just coat all the stone ones with the black Mod Podge, and then when it comes to the wood ones, I'll use instead of a black mix, I'll use a mix with brown, so that it acts as kind of my first base coat. I like the appearance rather than the black underneath, which creates very dark grooves sometimes. I kind of like the brown better. Alright, so it's painting up, which is one of the best parts, adding that top details where everything really comes through to show all the effort that you've put into marking things or making things with detail. I always start with a cashmere, it's called a cashmere tan, and it just sort of, I very gently brush across the top, kind of a semi-dry brush, just to give a little bit more color differences in the wood. I always kind of go with the grain on this, just so I don't create very deep pockets. But everyone has a different painting style, and of course, at this point is where you can kind of put your own kind of personal touch onto it. For the stone, I use the same cashmere. At one time I used to do the gray undertones, but again, Black Magic Craft started doing the stonework with a kind of a tan on the bottom, and I found that it gives a lot more character to the stone than just using all grays. So coat everything with a fairly heavy, for the stone ones, a fairly heavy tan, just to give it that first coat of color. And then once you've got that on, then you can come back and put some other colors on top. So I'm going to use 4 colors to get the different tones. I'm going to use a gray, a suede, a golden brown, and then I'm going to use a colonial blue, but I'm going to only apply a little bit to that one because it can be quite a high contrast. So first I'm going to coat everything with the gray, just a very I'll call it a heavy dry brush, just to get the base color on the large stones, and then I'll focus on individual stones on the smaller, the flagstone and the tiles. The gray gives a good base, and then by applying the other colors to different squares, you can get some nice different highlights and different tones. And then finally, I'll go over top of everything with a very light dry brush of the gray again, in order to blend everything together, to make it more uniform and look more like it's the same type of stone, more or less. That's just to create some type of highlights and some type of tone differences without making it obvious that they're random colors. Alright, now with the colors all in there in the different tones, now it comes to just giving everything a final brush of the gray again across the top, to kind of blend in all those different colors and those different hues, just so that it ends up that you can create a uniformity to the tile and it doesn't look like patchwork put together. Now, of course, for the last step, the magic step, or second to last step actually, but I've got a black wash that I use. It's a combination of actually a black and a few other colors, with a little bit of soap in it and mostly water. And then I'll just coat everything with a good coat of this black wash. Let it sit for a little bit and then dab off anything that might build up. I'll use this on the wood and the stone. This is what causes everything to sort of become more uniform in terms of looking like it's not patchwork. It also brings out all the deep grooves and character that has been built up by the texturing of the different tiles. Now I'm going to come back and take a little bit of warm white and a very light brush of warm white across the top surface. Picks up the highlights, picks up those the highest points, and gives the character that makes it look stone-like versus more like a matted surface after the black wash. find that this is the last step to really make things stand out and really give some details to those edges. For the wood, I'll use the same warm white and just give it a brush across the top. Picks up some of the grain, makes the wood details stand out a little bit more. And even on the one that's just one large block of wood, all that fine detail that the wire brushing did comes to surface. Alright, so let's take a look and see how it matches in or blends in with some of the existing tiles I have. So if we, this is just some existing wood tiles, and you can see these new ones are the ones that we worked on today, and they blend in nicely with it. And the nice thing about this tile system is that you can change out almost in infinite ways the tiles, and you can place them wherever you may want to have a given tile. You don't have to worry about having pre-made shapes like corners and grids, and it seems initially like it might be more work, but once you've got your base tile sets, you can mix and match and blend them in so many ways that it will get to a point where you no longer need to make new tiles as long as you have the base number to complete whatever you're working on. It makes it a lot more convenient and less reconstruction. So that's it for today. Hopefully it ends up you've enjoyed the video, and good crafting to all.